What's up guys, it's DoubleZug, so WARMASTER BLACKHORN. This is the 6th fight before Spine. In terms of heroic bosses in DS, this one isn't too difficult. I think it's easier than like, Ultraxian, Zonaz on progression. It's mostly an execution and positioning fight, as well as just, can your tanks live? I'm gonna quickly go through the mechanics here at first, and then do some positioning stuff, and then I'll go into healer tips. This fight is not a huge DPS or HPS check, honestly. Pretty easily 5 healable, especially if you have some gear at this point. But if you do want to be safe, you can always 6 heal it. Although I'd rather 3 tank 5 heal than 2 tank 6 heal on this fight, just because I do again think that the tank deaths are really going to be the biggest problem, not your HPS at all. So let's go really quickly over the mechanics to this fight. This fight is broken up into 2 phases. Phase 1 is an ad management fight, and then phase 2 is going to be tanking the boss as well as a dragon for a little while. Actually, I'm just going to go quickly over positioning while I talk about these phases and their mechanics. All right, so positioning, let's say this is the ship here. Let's just give it some nice color there. So for phase 1, you're going to have ads that will spawn in the middle. These are just going to be picked up by the tank and dragged to one of these sides. The reason why you tank them on the edge here is that you're going to have some drakes that will spawn on one side of the ship and then the other. These drakes are like a priority target for the ranged, and so we also want to drag the ads to them so that they can be cleaved by the melee. What I would recommend doing is have your tank drag to the first drake here. And what you're going to do is you're going to have all your ads stacked up here, you're going to have your tanks there, and you're going to have all the ranged and melee DPS and also healers are all going to be stacked up here within like melee distance of the ads. The reason for this is that the ads, well, they do a frontal for one, so you're going to be wanting to point that frontal away from the raid, but also they do a charge mechanic. And the way we're going to be doing this charge is just by baiting it out. So we're going to be breaking the ship up into like halves, top and bottom. Because the charge can only target players at range, all these people here are not going to be able to get targeted. So what we're going to do here is we're going to have like, maybe some hunters out here, and we're also going to have the other tank. So if you're 3 tanking, you're going to have 2 off tanks. If you're 2 tanking, you're just going to have your off tank. Especially if they're a blood DK. Blood DKs are really good at this. They can stay on their mount and go around like soaking little soaks. So your blood DK is going to be out here going to your little soaks. And what this means is that as long as every single player that's out here baiting stays on this side, every single charge that these mobs do is going to go this way, right? It's going to go to these hunters, it's going to go to your tank. And this means that because no charges are going to be going this way, everybody who's in the stack never has to move at all or worry about charges at all. So this is your basic setup. The little soaks you don't have to worry about if you're a healer or DPS. Just don't really bother with these. The tank will take care of them. So the other big mechanic in phase 1 is going to be the big soak. So every once in a while you're going to have a big soak that's going to spawn somewhere around the arena. The way we deal with this is we just have all the raids and the tanks run to the big soak. The ads will come with you, so you will have to watch out for those like frontals and stuff. This is a good time to disarm the ads. The ads are disarmable. Usually the charges don't like line up with the big soak in too bad of a way, but usually get them like right after. So the whole raid's going to go to the big soak. You're going to all stand in the big soak, pop a healer CD, take the big soak. This is also a great time for AMZ. This is like the one fight in the instance where AMZ is actually good. The ads will ideally be dead by the end of this big soak, but if they're not, you can kind of just stay here and have, the raid stack here and the tank stacked over here, and just kind of like be heads up with the charges as you're finishing the ads off. But ideally they should be dead by this time. And after you soak that big soak, the next ads are going to spawn here, and you're just going to tank them over here and do the exact same setup where you have ads, tanks, and then the entire raid stacked here. And you're just going to keep doing this exact same thing, just swapping back and forth with each ad section for the whole fight. The only other thing to mention here, which isn't really a big deal for healers, if there will be a sapper that will spawn that will run to try to like blow up the ship. These just have to be gripped in. They're also CCable, so if you're HPAL, you can, hodge them. And they're super easy to kill. So as long as you just have like basic awareness, you won't die to the sappers. Now we've talked through it in our MS Paint drawing. Let's show an example of this phase 1 positioning. So you're going to see here, this is the first ad set. The tank is going to drag them to the side over here. We have a raid marker down. This is where the entire raid is going to stack. On the left side from this POV of the ads, the tanks are on the right, and they're pointing the frontals this way. So we're cleaving the ads down. The Drake is going to drop down, and ranged are going to pry out the Drake as well as melee cleaving onto it. And you can see we have our hunters out here as well as our off tanks baiting those charges to the right. When the big soak happens, we have the entire raid move to the big soak. We pop a raid CD, in this case Spirit Link, and we soak the big soak. The ad should be dying at this time. If they're not, don't worry though, just avoid these charges, be heads up, kill the ads, and then obviously we're going to kill this other Drake. and you just repeat this over and over again. So let's look at the next set. Right, so the next ads come down, we just drag them to the Drake again, do the exact same positioning with the baiters out on the right here. So you just repeat this until phase 2 happens. All right, so now let's talk through phase 2 positioning here. So this is a little bit simpler. You're just gonna have the boss drop down. You can tank them anywhere. Most people tank them at the front. So you're gonna have the boss here, and then you're also gonna have a little while later, the dragon's gonna land. You just wanna tank these on top of each other. While the dragon is up in the air flying around, it's gonna shoot down little puddles. So you just want the range to be like out on the edge, whatever side your ranged are on. You want them on the edge so that these little puddles will be dropped somewhere where they're not on top of the boss. But if a puddle does get dropped too close to the boss, it's not a huge deal. You can just move the boss somewhere else and tank them there. It's not like they don't need to be tanked in this exact spot. It just doesn't really matter. But it is good to have those puddles baited out there. So ultimately, we're going to have our tanks in the front of the boss. We're going to have the boss here and the dragon here. The dragon is going to get killed off quickly. You can cleave onto the boss, but it's not a huge deal. You kind of want to just prior the dragon to kill it. So how are we going to position the raid here? Well, the boss does a targeted conal. We're going to deal with that by breaking the raid in half, like along the boss here. We're going to have melee on one side of this line, and we're going to have ranged on the other side. The range need to be 10 yards away from the boss because the boss does like an AoE interrupt ability, but you don't want to be that far because when the boss does its conal, it's either going to target the melee, in which case the melee run to this side, or it's going to target the ranged. And because of how triangles work, obviously the further you are away from the boss, the farther you have to run to get out of this conal attack. Ideally, you want to be like exactly 10 yards away so that you just have to move a little ways to get out of the conal instead of having to do like a marathon to get out of the conal. If you are close enough to the boss, you can also just kind of shimmy left and right and not have to swap sides at all. Positioning here is not super important. It's mostly just important that you dodge the shockwave, but in the ideal circumstance, and this is what like the racers were doing, you want to have both groups within a healing range. So healing range is like what, like 12 yards or something. Ideally, you want to be positioned such that one healing rain can heal the melee and the range and maybe even the tanks. But this is hard to do. This is not like super important. It's just a little optimization. So that's phase 2 positioning. Let's look at this in the pull. All right, so this is the Newman World First Kill video. I'm just going to show the positioning here that they do. It's super clean, obviously. They had a lot of reps. So they're baiting all the fire on the edge here with the ranged. And then they have some unfortunate flame in the middle of the boat. So I think they're going to take the boss on the left a little bit here. They're just stacking the Drake and the boss up. And you can see they're setting up this positioning where they have the melee here and the ranged here so that you're baiting conals away from each other. You can see the healing rains down. The ranged are inside the healing rain and the melee are inside the healing rain, and I think the tanks are even inside the healing rain. So if you can get this kind of like super tight, clean positioning, it's really nice for that healing rain optimization. 2 healing rains, if you have 2 Arshams, are going to do a huge amount of healing to that shout, especially as the boss gets stacks of Vengeance, which is another mechanic the boss has. As its health goes down, its damage goes up. When those shouts take you below Blessing of Eternals threshold, you're going to get a huge value on those healing rains if it's hitting the whole raid. So that's phase 2 positioning. Now I'm going to talk through healing composition. My ideal healing composition for this is like 5 healing. I don't think the HPS requirement is high enough to really justify 6, although the DPS check is not super high, so if you are uncomfortable with 5 healing this, you can always go 6. You do want a Disc Priest on this fight. Disc Priest is really good on this fight because it creates a lot of wiggle room for like getting one shot. Most of your deaths on this fight are not going to be from rot damage. It's going to be from getting one shot by like a double charge, a charge plus a cleave, by being not fully topped off as you go into a big soak, missing a cooldown. And Discipline Priest, if you're just spamming POH and you're doing like some pre-shielding and stuff like that, you can really prevent a lot of like dumb deaths on this fight. Obviously, if you're like perfectly positioning and executing perfectly, you can just kind of like spam Atonement or even just drop the Disc Priest. But for the average raider, I think that pre-shielding on this fight's very valuable. The ideal composition for this fight is probably like double Paladin, double Resto Shaman, Disc Priest. And then if you flex up to a 6 heal, you can take, you know, an H Priest or a Resto Druid. Double SLT is really nice, as well as Healing Rain being very powerful in the last phase. So that's healing composition. Healing tips for phase 1. On Disc Priest, I would be spamming a lot of POH and doing a lot of pre-shielding. If the ads are dying very slowly, you can obviously just do a lot of Atonement healing here, but I do think that pre-shielding and spamming a lot of POH to get a lot of Divine Aegis on the raid is very valuable and will save you a lot of like dumb progression deaths on this fight. You should also keep a power word shield on the off tank that's soaking the little soaks. Same thing goes for your other healers. You want to be rolling hots, renew, rejuve. You want to potentially even put one beacon on the off tank who's soaking those little soaks. They will be taking a lot of damage and they do need to be topped off before their next soak. For the most part, your non-disc healers can kind of just focus on tank healing here. One other thing to mention is that you can see on the bottom right here, my pet frames. Pets do take a lot of damage from the frontal cleave, so be sure to heal the pets up. If you're POHing into any groups with pets, you'll do a lot of incidental healing to those pets as well. So just be sure to, you know, not let people's pets die if you can help it. So that's phase one, not a huge HPS check. As long as you have people topped off between the big soaks and you just focus those tanks until like the tanks die, you should be perfectly successful here. The HPS on this section of the fight is like very 3 or 4 healable, honestly. It's very low. Most of your deaths in this phase of the fight will come from people accidentally soaking small soaks when they're not supposed to, or your baiters messing up and you getting a charge or two through the raid. So proper play on this section of the fight will make the HPS check very low. When it comes to healing tips for phase 2, the healing here is pretty simple, and what I'm going to tell you to do is really simple, but you're not going to like it because it involves prioritizing tank healing over doing big, huge HPS and blasting the raid. The main wipe condition here is going to be tank deaths. It's by far the most dangerous part of this phase. Tanks are going to take huge damage, and they're going to get absolutely trucked by the devastate ability that the boss does, which is just like a big tank buster. It's another big reason why I think 3 tanking, 5 healing is actually better than 6 healing, 2 tanking, just because it makes this phase of the fight a lot easier. Also, Feral Druid is very powerful here because it has such a high dodge chance and it can dodge that tank buster, which also puts a debuff on the tank. So again, for healers here, the main important thing is when that roar goes out, you're going to be very sorely tempted to just blast as much AoE healing as you possibly can, but that's going to result in a lot more wipes than just focusing those tanks, especially like, you know, Holy Paladin, Disc Priest are the main 2 that are going to be tempted to Radiance and POH, but if you are wiping on this fight, it's very important that you just be casting into the tank. Atonement here also has a little bit of a weakness because when that roar does go out, it's very possible that your atonement is going to cleave to a melee or a ranged rather than the tank, and that can result in tank death. So when that shout is about to go out, I would recommend casting direct heals into the tank, like a Penance GH or something like that, as opposed to atonementing. Holy Paladins is a great fight for Tower of Radiance. You can just spam DL into the tank with your beacon on them and use your LOD to passively heal that shout damage up. Just the Resto Shaman's healing rain, as well as if you have any kind of like hot healer in the raid, just their healing will be usually enough to passively heal the raid up and top them between those roars. And as long as players are properly dodging shockwave, you shouldn't have any deaths to roars. Ideally, you'll be saving your healing and DR cooldowns like SLT and barrier for those later disrupting roars. But even if you don't have a raid cooldown with current gear and just the high stamina, players should not be dying to roar. If you do find yourself regularly dying to tank deaths in this phase, it can be a good opportunity to use a more tank healing focused spec similar to the specs that we might have used in Firelands, especially in a 10-man. If you are more comp restricted and you have some healers that might not necessarily be great at tank healing, you can always use like a Living Seed build. You can take some more tank healing focused talents for Resto Shaman, etc. That's something to keep in mind, particularly for 10-man. For 25-man, your default specs should be just fine for this fight, especially if you're 6 healing, but even 5 healing, if you do just consciously try to focus the tank healing as well as have your externals, your hand sacks, your PSs, your GSs, etc. well set up on the tanks, you shouldn't have too much trouble with this section of the fight. Final thing to mention for phase 2 here is the Drake will do a healing debuff. You can see here it goes on the Hunter. The way you deal with this is you just let your passive raid healing heal this off. You don't want to like focus target it, because if you focus target it, it will do a lot more damage. As it gets healed through, it will do some ticking AoE. This is like aura masteryable as shadow damage. It's also immunable. Honestly, if you just kind of ignore this healing debuff and pretend it's not there and heal normally, it will just passively get healed off and you don't have to worry about it at all. When it comes to potion usage on this fight as a healer, there's like pretty much 2 things you should be doing. You should either be concentration potting in this part of the fight where your last ads are dying and the boss is about to drop down. There's a really long period of time here where nothing happens, where you can sit like a full concentration pot. The second option here is to wait until the last 30 seconds of the fight and use a volcanic potion for throughput. Both options are really great if you have improperly managed your mana in section 1 and maybe you're kind of close to and you want to have a full mana bar going to the tank section, conk pot. Otherwise, if your mana is healthy, I'd recommend saving a volcanic potion for the last part of the fight to get a little bit of extra oomph on the tank healing as well as in passively healing up those big shouts at the end of the fight. When it comes to like special talent or glyph tech here. There's really not anything. I would recommend using Barrier Glyph here, but you should be using Barrier Glyph for like every fight in DS. One other thing to mention is that a lot of the raid damage is physical, with the Disrupting Roar being physical as well as Shockwave being physical. So for Holy Paladins, you want to unglyph Divine Protection, so you get the 20% Fizz DR. And for Priests, you can potentially use Glyph of Inner Fire to get a little bit of extra armor. As well as for any shield-wearing healers, you can always swap a shield on over an offhand that's not a shield to get a little bit of extra armor. Also, because Roar and Shockwave are physical, you can use a Devotion Aura Mastery to reduce damage there, as well as to give a little bit of a DR to the tanks. So that's War Master. Again, not a hugely complicated fight, mostly just execution and positioning, as well as focusing tank healing in the last phase. If you enjoyed the video or learned something, you can always send a like and subscribe. If you have any questions, comment below. I also do have a Discord server you can join. Thanks for watching. See ya.
Swobu, Zug Zug.